He thought it was just another quiet morning. The sun was out, the street was calm, and inside his own home, he should have felt safe. But safety was the last thing waiting for him that day. Without warning, strange men in uniforms appeared at his door, claiming they had authority, demanding answers and insisting he owed something that never even existed. Their voices grew sharper, their threats heavier. Neighbors peeked through blinds, whispering as if they were witnessing a scandal. But behind the spectacle, something far darker was unfolding. This wasn't about rules or fees. This wasn't about order. It was about power, prejudice, and a man who suddenly found himself treated as if his very existence was a crime. He wasn't just fighting for his name. He was fighting against a lie built to strip him of dignity, to make him small in a place he had every right to stand tall. But what the intruders didn't know was that the man they cornered had lived through battles far greater than this one. And when the truth finally surfaced, the outcome would shock everyone watching. So how did a simple morning in his neighborhood turn into a standoff that exposed something much deeper? This is the story you were never meant to hear. It started like any other day. David woke early, laced up his running shoes, and jogged through the quiet streets of his neighborhood. Discipline was second nature to him. Years of service had made sure of that. Neighbors often saw him at dawn, nodding politely as he passed, never realizing the strength and sacrifice hidden beneath his calm demeanor. To most, he was just another resident, blending into the rhythm of suburban life. At home, he lived simply. A modest house, a carefully tended lawn, and a routine that gave him peace. He wasn't flashy and didn't draw attention to himself. After years of deployments, David valued stillness more than anything. His home was supposed to be his safe space, a place where he didn't have to look over his shoulder or brace for hostility. But even in this quiet neighborhood, he knew the undercurrent of suspicion. The stares that lingered too long. The questions about whether he really lived there. He brushed it off and told himself not to dwell on it. After all, he had endured far harsher environments than whispers and side eyes. Still, he could feel it, an invisible weight that followed him, a reminder that no matter what he had given for his country, some people only saw him through a narrow lens. That morning, David went about his day with no idea what was waiting just beyond the calm. He made coffee, read the news, and stepped outside to water his plants. Ordinary moments, small routines, nothing that hinted at the storm about to erupt. Because while David thought he was starting another peaceful day at home, others in the neighborhood were plotting something very different, something that would soon turn his sanctuary into a battleground. David didn't notice the cars at first. He was inside, focused on watering his plants, letting the quiet of the morning carry him. But then he heard it, doors slamming, voices outside. Not the casual greetings of neighbors, not the sound of kids playing. These voices were sharp, commanding, and filled with authority they didn't truly have. When he stepped to his window, he saw them, men in uniforms that looked official enough to fool anyone glancing quickly. Badges pinned to their shirts, radios clipped to their belts, and the kind of confidence that came from believing no one would dare question them. They weren't police, not real ones, but to anyone else they certainly wanted to look the part. David felt his stomach tighten. 3 men walked up his driveway, their boots crunching against the gravel, their voices carrying the weight of accusation. One of them slapped a piece of paper against his door, announcing loudly that he was in violation. Behind on HOA fees, they said. Fees he didn't even owe. At first, David tried to brush it off as a mistake. But the tone wasn't one of bureaucracy, it was intimidation. Their words weren't requests. They were threats, sharpened to cut deep. They called him delinquent. They told him he didn't belong. And all the while, neighbors began to gather quietly, peering from behind curtains, their silence as heavy as the men's accusations. David could feel it, the shift from a simple claim about money to something far more sinister. Their eyes didn't just accuse him of debt. They accused him of existing in a place they didn't believe he deserved to be. And that realization burnt deeper than any false charge. He stepped outside, calm but firm, asking for proof, asking for legitimacy. That's when one of them smirked, leaning in just close enough to make his threat feel personal. "You can come with us now, or we'll make you." Those words chilled him. Not because he feared them, but because he recognized the intent. They weren't here for justice. They were here to humiliate him, to strip him of dignity in front of the people who watched from their windows. David knew the rules of survival in moments like this. He'd been trained to read a situation, to sense the danger before it erupted, and everything in his gut told him these men wanted escalation. They wanted to provoke him into a mistake. He took a breath, steadying himself, but the insults kept coming. They shouted louder now, demanding he comply. They listed fake charges, trespassing, refusal to pay, even resisting an officer. The audacity was staggering. But what cut deepest was how easily they cloaked lies in the fabric of authority. The crowd outside grew. Some neighbors whispered. Others simply watched. Not one stepped forward. Not one raised a voice to say this wasn't right. David felt the isolation settle over him like a shadow. He wasn't just facing 3 imposters at his door. He was facing a system of silence that let them believe they could get away with it. And still, he stood. He refused to bow his head and refused to give them the satisfaction of fear. But with every passing second, the air thickened with tension. The men's hands lingered near their belts, their postures daring him to react. Then came the threat that changed everything. "If you don't come willingly, we'll put you in cuffs." "Right here, right now," the words echoed like a gunshot. David's heart pounded, not in fear but in anger. He had faced hostile checkpoints in war zones, and he had endured missions that tested every ounce of his strength. Yet here, in his own driveway, men playing dress-up as enforcers had the power to drag his name through the mud. The injustice was suffocating. It wasn't about fees. It wasn't about rules. It was about control, about reminding him of where they thought he belonged. He clenched his jaw, weighing his choices. If he resisted, they'd twist it into proof. If he complied, they'd strip him of his dignity. Either way, they thought they'd win. But David knew something they didn't. He wasn't just any man standing on a driveway. He was someone who had endured far worse, trained to face threats far greater than these. Still, in this moment, he didn't reveal that. Not yet. He stood in silence, letting them believe they held the upper hand. And as they moved closer, circling like predators ready to pounce, David realized this wasn't just his fight. It was a test of how far they would go when they thought no one could stop them. The driveway felt like a battlefield, each second dragging heavier than the last. Their voices rose, their accusations louder, their threats sharper. And all around, the silence of the neighborhood screamed louder than words. Then one of the men reached for his arm. That single motion cracked the fragile calm, because in that instant, David understood. The moment he had tried to avoid was here. And what happened next would determine more than just his mourning. It would expose a truth they never wanted the world to see. The grip on his arm tightened. It wasn't a request anymore. It was a show of dominance. David could feel the pressure of the man's hand digging into his skin, a warning that this was only the beginning. The others closed in, circling him like predators waiting for blood. For a split second, the world slowed. David's heart pounded in his chest, every sense sharpened. He'd faced hostile checkpoints in foreign deserts and stared down real enemies armed with real weapons. Yet somehow this moment in his own neighborhood burned worse. Not because of danger, but because of the insult. Because they looked at him as if he were nothing. The men shouted louder, their words laced with venom. "You don't belong here. You think you can ignore us? You're coming with us, now." Each phrase hit like a blow, not to his body but to his dignity. Neighbors, neighborhood burnt, leaned closer to their windows, and phones began to rise, recording what they thought might become a spectacle. David stood frozen, not in fear, but in calculation. Every instinct screamed at him to defend himself. Every ounce of training told him he could end this in seconds. But he knew the stakes. One wrong move and they would spin it into proof that he was dangerous. Proof that he was exactly what they wanted the world to believe. Then came the breaking point. One of the imposters yanked a pair of cuffs from his belt, the metal glinting in the sun. He shoved David against the hood of a car, pressing down hard, eager to humiliate him in front of everyone watching. The crowd gasped, phones recording every second, and still, David didn't fight back. Not yet, because what the men didn't know was who he really was. A man who had served, a man who had endured more than they could ever imagine. His silence wasn't weakness. It was restraint, restraint born from a lifetime of discipline. But as the cold steel of the cuffs brushed his wrist, David lifted his head. His eyes locked onto the nearest neighbor's phone camera. And in that moment, he made a choice. He would not let this moment be buried. He would not let their lies go unseen. He planted his feet, his voice cutting through the chaos with a calmness that silenced even the imposters. "You have no authority here," the words echoed across the street, steady and unshaken. The men faltered, their performance slipping as uncertainty cracked through their bravado. For the first time, it was clear. They weren't in control anymore. The standoff had shifted. The truth was teetering on the edge, ready to explode into the open. And as David stood tall, staring down his accusers, one question hung heavy in the air. Would this be the moment they finally realized who they were dealing with? The moment hung in silence. The cuffs hovered just inches from David's wrist, but his words had cut deeper than any struggle could. "You have no authority here." For the first time, the imposters hesitated. Their eyes darted to the crowd and to the cameras capturing every second, and suddenly their confidence began to unravel. What they thought would be a private display of dominance was now a public spectacle, and the world was watching. Neighbors whispered. Some who had stayed quiet out of fear now stepped out onto their porches, emboldened by the sight of a man refusing to be broken. Phones were raised higher and voices murmured louder. And in that shift, the power dynamic changed. The men realized their performance had failed. They weren't the ones in control anymore. David was. With a final sneer, they dropped the act, shoving the cuffs back into their belt. They muttered half-hearted threats, promising this wasn't over, before retreating down the driveway. Their uniforms suddenly looked like costumes. Their badges are like props. They climbed back into their cars, speeding away, leaving behind nothing but the bitter taste of their failure. David stood still, chest rising and falling slowly, his gaze fixed on the spot where they had stood. He hadn't needed to raise a fist. He hadn't needed to prove his strength. His dignity, his restraint, and his courage had exposed them for what they were. Frauds who thought fear alone could strip him of his humanity. But the victory was bittersweet. Because even though they had retreated, the truth remained. They came for him not because of fees, not because of rules, but because of who he was. And that truth cut deeper than any confrontation. As he walked back inside his home, the adrenaline gave way to reflection. This wasn't just about him. This was about every person who had been cornered, accused, or humiliated for simply existing in a space someone else thought they didn't belong in. It was about the unspoken rule that silence allows injustice to breathe. About the quiet stares from neighbors who watched but didn't act until it was safe. David carried the weight of that moment, but he also carried its lesson. He knew his story wasn't isolated. It was part of a pattern, one stitched into the fabric of everyday life for countless others. And while he had stood his ground, he couldn't ignore the painful question, what happens to those who can't? Because for every David who walks away, there are others who don't. Others whose stories never reach the cameras, whose dignity is stripped in silence, whose names never make headlines. That's the deeper injustice, the one that doesn't vanish when the imposters leave. It lingers in the fear people carry, in the suspicion cast on ordinary lives, and in the way trust is eroded every time dignity is denied. And so David's stand became more than just a moment in his driveway. It became a reminder that racism isn't always loud. It doesn't always come in the form of slurs or open violence. Sometimes it hides in uniforms that aren't real, in accusations that don't exist, in neighbors who choose silence over solidarity. But silence is a choice, and every choice shapes the world we live in. So as his story ends, a question remains for us. When we see injustice, will we stay silent or will we stand? Because David's fight may have ended that morning, but the fight for dignity, for equality, and for truth is far from over. This isn't just his story. It's a reflection of millions. And the real question is, how many more times must this happen before the world finally listens?